Politics meets real life. We break down state and federal issues, showing how policy shapes everyday Americans. Engaged, balanced, and informative. That's our promise. And I'm your host, Mikkel Jenkins. So we're going to be providing a update on the Iran, Israel, and United States war, as well as some additional global updates and domestic updates as well. So the 2026 Iran war launched with major U.S. Israeli strikes on February 28th, targeting Iranian leadership, nuclear strikes, missiles, and infrastructure entered its sixth week under a very shaky ceasefire. The 2 week pause has held on direct strikes but remains strained on Hormuz access. Iran partially reopened the strait with various restrictions, such as the fees that we were talking about in earlier episodes. The U.S. has announced with its blockade that started on Monday that no vessels have passed in the first 48 hours of the blockade, and that nine vessels complied, sorry, with orders to turn around toward Iranian ports. However, BBC Verify analysis of independent tracking data shows approximately 15 vessels transited the Strait of Hormuz during the first full days of enforcement. Of those, nine had links to Iran, and at least six had previously visited Iranian ports, with two more departing near the Chabahar port. So there has been limited commercial shipping, which continues through alternative routes, but oil flows face disruption risk. And Iran warns of severe retaliation and regional instability. So even though that we have a lot of tough talk from this administration about this blockade that they implemented on Monday, we are clearly seeing that Iranian and Chinese vessels are getting through, and that this blockade is somehow basically ineffective. How there are alternative routes that Iran is able to access and to still allow for their oil to leave their country. So, as we all know, with these talks are continuing going on, I do believe that this is actually a groundwork and a stallment for U.S. troops to be deployed in the Middle East. There have been reports that about 10,000 more troops are going to be deploying to the Middle East, such as sailors and Marines. And this is amid the blockade and negotiations. So I do believe that this pile up of U.S. troops within the Middle East, as these ceasefire talks are starting to continue on, is just really a precipice for a ground invasion to take place. There had been reports that had emerged that China was considering arming Iran with various air defense systems, and President Trump stated that he exchanged letters with Xi Jinping and claimed China agreed not to send weapons, and said Beijing is very happy the U.S. is working permanently to open Strait of Hormuz, even though China's foreign minister denied providing military support to Iran. So we are seeing that Trump is once again moving the table in shifty ways to try to pat himself on the back for reopening the straits by having a conversation with Xi Jinping, where this has never even happened because China had denied even providing military support to Iran. And mediators for these negotiations, which include Pakistan, Egypt, and Turkey, continue in an effort ahead of the April 21st and 22nd expiration for this ceasefire. U.S. officials reported that negotiators made progress on Tuesday, and this progress was towards a framework agreement to end the war, describing incremental movement and bridging remaining gaps, which we know one of those major gaps is the uranium enrichment. Basically, the United States wanted complete zero enrichment, uranium enrichment from Iran. And I know that Iran had proposed as a counter proposal 5 years, but the United States wasn't even buckling at that as well, unfortunately. But the White House has indicated that the next round of US Iran talks will likely be held once again in Islamabad, Pakistan. However, the White House rejects reports that the US has requested a ceasefire extension, which has been repeatedly reported. Trump has described the war as very close to over and suggested renewed engagement without needing an extension if talks advance quickly. So I believe that these talks in Pakistan are going to be happening Thursday. So I do hope there is some ground made within these talks. And as all of this is continuing to go on, Israel continues their ground incursions and air raids in southern Lebanon targeting Hezbollah. And it's frightening to see that even on Apple Maps, it's been shown that within this region of Lebanon that they've actually removed the names of these towns. So not only are we seeing a reinforcement on the global stage of these attacks on Lebanon, we're seeing it on the corporation stage as well, where they are acknowledging these levels of strikes and even accepting this level of genocide that is happening to the Lebanese people by Israel. And Israel and Lebanese officials had held talks on a potential peace deal within the United States, with Israel now considering a ceasefire with Lebanon, which hopefully that is the case. I mean, we know that Israel only wants the continuation of this war with Iran, and hopefully the United States is able to reel them in to where we can have a ceasefire, not just within not just within Lebanon, but also within Iran, because Lebanese people don't deserve this continued genocidal bombardments on a daily basis, even though that the Israeli government continues to state that there is Hamas embedded within that region, but they are striking civilians across the board. And while Netanyahu continues to crusade across the Middle East, the Jerusalem District Court approved, unfortunately, a cancellation of three scheduled hearings for the Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's testimony in his corruption trial this week, citing security and political risk linked to original developments. So, as we can see, Netanyahu has a personal gain, almost in the similarity to Trump, to continue on this war and his presidency or his reign as prime minister, so that he does not go to jail. I mean, we see the levels of corruption that Netanyahu has been intertwined in, and all of the hurdles that this case has gone through. We've seen judges killed and assassinated left and right in efforts to push this corruption case back even further. So now we're going to see it pushed back, possibly on Thursday, or there's going to be additional requests to see this pushed further down the line to where we'll see, even who knows if a corruption trial is even brought about. And on the global economic side, kind of want to dive into some of the ripple effects that are happening from this continued blockade and so forth. And we know that the Strait of Hormuz, which carries normally 20 million barrels of oil per day, the blockade and prior disruptions have caused a major supply shock, estimated at 8 to 11 million barrels per day. And Brent crude oil rose between 4.3% to an estimated $99 per barrel, and WTI to 99 per barrel, holding near $100 with an oil premium. And earlier conflict peaks reached at 112 to 120. So we've seen the stock market, especially within the oil aspect, rise and fall drastically, and we're seeing a very much dive down of that from the progress in talks that we have seen. And hopefully these talks do lead to a ceasefire, and that Americans are better off within their wallets, because we know that these damning cost rises within gas have really hit a lot of Americans, and we've been really starting to feel it on a lot of avenues. And with these rising costs and disruptions, rerouting of routes has raised freight and insurance costs significantly. Asia and Europe energy importers face the greatest exposure over all of this. Risk includes slower global GDP growth and recession pressures if prices stay elevated. And the White House has announced it will also end sanction waivers, allowing India and other countries to buy Russian and Iranian oil, tightening pressure on global energy markets. So we are seeing that the United States is feeling this crunch in the global energy market, very full throttled. And we're also seeing that we're now allowing and wavering our adversaries, such as Russia, to buy, well, such as India, to buy oil from Russia and Iran. So we're seeing that one of our allies is being permitted to buy oil from our adversaries and enriching our adversaries because we are currently at war at the request of Israel, as always. And this is only going to hurt us more down the line when we see that potentially there is not going to be a ceasefire reached because Israel does not want this to happen. They want to have their borders continuously expanded into Turkey, into Pakistan, and further into Iran. And to topple all of these governments and to become the major superpower, not just within the Middle East, but around the world. And with Israel's continued calculated mishaps, it's only going to allow for this conflict to continue on and for further strain within the America's perception within the global alliances that we currently have. We know that a lot of our allies are starting to come against Israel. We know that the EU, Spain, and other countries are starting to look at trade agreements and security agreements that they have with Israel, and it's really becoming damning to a point where an allegiance with Israel is a negative, a net negative within the global and even domestic sphere that we're seeing. And I'm going to turn now more to the domestic side of things. Um, there was recently a event with JD Vance at Turning Point USA. So yesterday, Vice President JD Vance addressed a Turning Point USA event at the University of Georgia in Athens. The gathering drew a notable, very small crowd with more empty seats than attendees, despite free tickets. Erica Kirk withdrew due to serious threats, and the spokesperson had ended up filling in. Vance faced heckling from audience members criticizing U.S. Middle East policy and also the depiction that Trump made of himself as Jesus Christ, with individuals stating that Jesus Christ does not support genocide and you're killing children, and also chiming in on the comments that he's made about Pope Leo. So we've seen from this event is a very glaring picture that the Republicans are looking at. You're seeing at Turning Point USA, one of the biggest and most influenced conservative organizations for young individuals. And you're seeing such a small turnout, and even hecklers uh, going against the vice president of the United States, who is supposed to be, positioned as the individual to succeed Trump. But even the Financial Times is reporting that that is seeming not the case, given his fumbles that he has had. But it's a realization that Republicans are going to have that MAGA and what was supposed to be MAGA and what has now been shown as MAGA is now just Israel first has been felt as a lot of betrayal by a lot of voters that voted for Trump, not just within his um, current presidency, but also within his 2025 presidential win in his first term. A lot of individuals are feeling the betrayal from the Trump administration, and that a lot of the issues that he ran on are falling flat, like especially on the farmers. Farmers, you're seeing fertilizer skyrockets. You're seeing your soybean production sliced in almost half, just given what he was doing with China. And you're seeing your relief being very minimal and almost pennies in a bucket compared to what all of these other industries have been able to get, especially these corporations with these tax cuts. And we'll get into that as today is tax day. But it's really just eye opening to see that from this event, you're seeing a lot of normal conservatives not follow suits and start to speak out what this administration has been doing and how it's completely against the grain, um, to what was originally sold to them. And you're going to see a lot more of this dove into from the media side of things, and not just on the mishaps from the Trump administration, but also the mishaps within both parties. Which I'm glad to say that TMZ is launching a DC bureau. So TMZ announced that there will be a TMZ DC on April 13th, and they will be stationing three producers on Capitol Hill to cover Congress, scrutinize lawmakers, and expose pop culture, politics intersections. The move is expected heightened scrutiny of political misconduct and recent resignations, such as Slawwell and a few others, individuals such as Representative Gonzalez on the Republican side. But this is great that we're seeing TMZ actually get into this space, because it almost seems like that this is what TMZ was truly meant for. You're going to see a lot of buckling and a lot of frights from congressional members, because TMZ is not afraid to go really pierce the veil through what a lot of these major networks are afraid to do, and actually report on the scandalous information that Americans need to hear. So I am excited to see all of the news that will be coming out from this TMZ DC bureau office. But as I was speaking to regarding tax day and how Americans are faring through all of the policy promises that Trump has fallen flat on, want to talk about the impact of the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. So on tax day, millions of Americans are filing their 2025 returns under the rules under the One Big Beautiful Bill, which was signed into law July 4th, 2025. The legislation made permanent most individual tax cuts from the 2017 TCJA, which were lower rates, higher standard deductions, and added targeted relief such as no taxes on tips and overtime through 2028, and enhanced senior deduction and expandable business expenses. The Tax Foundation estimates that the average taxpayer will receive a tax cut of roughly 2,300 to 3,800 in 2026, contributing to larger refunds this filing season. However, analysis from the Institute of Taxation and Economic Policy indicate that at least 88 profitable U.S. corporations paid zero in federal tax income in 2025, despite 105 billion in collective pre-tax profits, largely due to restored 100% bonus depreciation and R&D expense provisions. Corporations in the top 1% have received the largest absolute benefit from the big beautiful bill tax implications, with the top 1% projected to receive approximately 1 trillion in tax cuts over the decade. While many working families see some relief, critics note that average Americans outside the highest income brackets receive relatively smaller gains, and the bill's deficient impact could contribute to higher effective costs or reduce services in future years. So it was all just a guise, ladies and gentlemen, just a guise of this big, beautiful bill that it was so great. It's going to do so great for the average American taxpayer and individual, and that Dodge was going to make all of these cuts to make things more affordable. All of these things were just smoke blown up your nose, and you're seeing, as it's reported from bipartisan tax, um, foundations and organizations that the average American is getting the smaller slice of the pie, and we have been for decades, not just from Trump's policies, but from all of Republican tax policies. We have seen on a average basis, when you look at Republican and Democratic presidency cycle, that every time that Republican presidents they start a war, raise cut taxes for corporations and state that it's going to be beneficial for the middle class. And we see the opposite take effect every single time. And it's time for voters to truly wake up, and especially Republican voters to wake up that the American economy is going to be in a crisis if we continue to allow these cuts to happen. And these corporations aren't allowing higher employment. We're seeing that with these cuts that there are record levels of stock buybacks, excuse me, and record levels of job cuts across the board. Oracle themselves cut almost 20 to 30,000 individuals due to their expansion and the capabilities of AI. But yet they are still getting further tax cuts and or not even paying federal taxes. So it's just criminal to see that in a state of desperation where you have individuals living paycheck to paycheck, individuals skipping their medication payments and things of that nature, where we have corporations rising at the top and amassing wealth at greater nations. It seems very fitting that Trump's golden age of America that he touted has been truly only for the 1% and not for the rest of us. And what also is going on Capitol Hill is the FISA Section 702 reauthorization debate. For individuals that do not know, the Section 702 of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, FISA, allows U.S. intelligence agencies, primarily NSA, to collect electronic communications of targeted foreign nationals collected outside the United States without individual warrants. It is considered a critical tool for counterterrorism, counterproliferation, and monitoring threats such as those from Iran. The provision is set to expire on Monday, April 20th. House GOP leaders have canceled all remaining votes for the rest of the day today amid an internal rebellion over the FISA extension, with no 9:15 p.m. vote scheduled tonight. FISA talks are ongoing between the White House GOP leadership and House GOP hardliners. Speaker Mike Johnson told Politico that negotiations on warrants and other issues remain unresolved, saying we're working through it right now and demanding and remaining non-committal about reaching a deal in time for a Senate vote for a House vote, sorry. Senate Majority Leader John Thune said he would consider keeping the Senate in session through the weekend if the House sends over a bill before tomorrow, though he calls it a big if, as there is now currently being reported no further votes tonight, and could seek a time agreement to speed up the process, which would likely require holding amendment votes. And just diving into the Republican debate points and differences, you have proponents. This includes House Leadership Intelligence Chair Rick Crawford and Trump administration officials such as CIA Director Ratcliffe, FBI Director Patel, and NSA Director Gabbard argue that the clean extension, which is what has been put up, is essential to avoid intelligence gaps amid the Iran conflict. And they cite post 2024 reforms and reduced FBI compliance issues. President Trump urged unity on Truth Social and stated he is willing to give up rights and privileges afforded to citizens under FISA to prioritize national security. Just take that in, ladies and gentlemen. The Republican Party, who used to be against the surveillance states, you now have their leader in chief, leader of their party, leader of the MAGA movement, leader of the America First movement, stating he is willing to give up rights and privileges afforded to citizens under the FISA to prioritize national security. So we're seeing that he is willing to walk over our continued rights of non surveillance. And I do understand, and don't get me wrong, I understand the prevalence and the danger of Iran and of a attack on our home, but that doesn't restrict the fact that we as citizens should see curtailment on our rights and privileges as citizens. That is what our founding fathers had fought against consistently, and it is up to us to continue that fight when we see levels of trampling on our rights starting to take shape. Critics within the GOP, which are the Freedom Caucus members, which include Representative Thomas Massey, Andy Briggs, and Warren Davison, continue to push for a warrant requirement for backdoor searches of U.S. persons' data, citing Fourth Amendment concerns and past abuses. I love how these individuals of the Freedom Caucus are speaking true to truly what our forefathers saw forth when it came to surveillance within the United States and on issues such as this. Bipartisan reform proposals seek probable cause warrants with emergency exceptions, and there are votes in the narrow GOP majority, which remain very, very tight. And as well as this debate continues to go on, there is still a few rumors and talks about a skinny Reconciliation 2.0 bill. Republicans are negotiating a narrow reconciliation bill with a simple majority passage for priorities such as ICE and CBP funding by June 1st. Some conservatives push for a broader package, which would include all of those voter reforms that would be in the SAVE Act or war related supplemental funding. Leadership favors discipline, while slim majorities in Iran cost complicate the message a lot. And they are going to be looking for a very tough November if a lot of these voting reforms and even war related supplemental funding is included, because a lot of America are against these reforms, because especially on the voting side of things, you can't even vote under the SAVE Act with your birth certificate, driver's license, or things of that nature. You would need an original birth certificate, which millions of Americans don't have, and millions of married women do not have an updated birth certificate. So it's going to be a hard pill to swallow for the Republicans come November if they do not get their act together, which I fully doubt that is going to be something that happens. And just on the uh, domestic ripple effects of what's going on from legislatively and what's going on with our administration's decisions with Iran, 26 out of 27 EU countries supported partial suspension of their trade agreements with Israel amid criticism of Israel actions in Lebanon and the Iran conflict. As we last spoke in our previous episode, we talked about how Turkey and Spain have begun to speak out against Israel and how Spain has now pointed the finger at Turkey as them being the next great enemy, and as well as there have been corruption charges that have been filed against the president of Spain's wife after these points have been made against Israel. Spain and Turkey have taken very hardline positions, sharply condemning alleged breaches of international law and urging de escalation with Iran between the United States and Israel. Europe is also accelerating a fallback plan for NATO in case President Trump pulls out of the alliance, which he has been encroaching towards. And the contingency aims to maintain deterrence against Russia and operational continuity by placing more Europeans in key command and control roles. Israel is considering a ceasefire, as we've talked about with the following recent talks with Lebanon. On the domestic side of things as well, higher energy costs are pushing transportation, manufacturing, and food expenses higher in the United States, potentially adding 0.5 to 1% plus points to inflation. And a new American Farm Bureau Federation survey finds that, as I was talking to earlier about our farmers, that 70% of US farmers are currently unable to afford all the fertilizer they need for the 2026 crop season, with the South hit the hardest. So you're going to see a lot of rising prices at the grocery store if this fertilizer situation is not fully apprehended. And the fertilizer shortage and price spikes how are going to be only exacerbated by these further disruptions within the Strait of Hormuz, and are forcing a lot of tough decisions on planting and yields. This is expected to contribute to higher prices later in 2026 and reduced farm profitability. U.S. gas prices are also climbing again after affecting households and businesses. The White House has rejected continued reports that the U.S. has requested some form of a ceasefire extension, while the U.S. is preparing for a potential. Of course, we're expanding our foothold once again, looking to potentially expand our foothold with a Cuba military operation. And this is all on the request if Trump should give his order on Cuba to be invaded by the United States, or there to be some operations to take place. So, with these combined ripple effects, what's going on internationally and domestically, we're seeing that Americans really are the ones that are being hurt the most at their wallets economically. We are seeing individuals abroad are being hurt the most physically as these genocidal bombs are being just laid waste on Lebanon left and right, and even on Gaza as well, because that's a situation we cannot um keep our eye on as well. And it's just damning to see Israel just continue its crusade across the Middle East, and that we are just continuing to bow our head and knee to them. But hopefully we will see that the American people are really able to retain that America first ideology, which was so much sold to us with this Trump presidency. And as always, to our listeners, thank you again for joining us today on Behind the Ballot, where we keep politics engaged, balanced, and informative. Stay curious and stay critical, and always stay involved. I'm Mikhail Jenkins, and until next time, keep looking beyond the headlines and behind the ballot. Thank you.